it. At Visualpolitik, we are faithful to traditions. One of them is the Visualpolitik Awards for the most outstanding political protagonists of the year, and another is the Visualpolitik Anti-awards. We celebrate Christmas with you every year by handing out what we call the Visualpolitik Anti-awards. That is, the Santa Claus of Visualpolitik delivers coal to the politicians who have disappointed us the most in the year. And this is important to clarify. These are not the worst politicians of the year, otherwise Putin would have taken them all. No, it's about the politicians who have disappointed us the most. And you know what? If in 2021 the competition was already tight, this year has yet to be plain sailing either. With a war, an energy crisis, soaring inflation, things could have been smoother sailing. And in such a political context, we have seen the worst and the best. We have had many positive surprises, but on the other hand, more than a few politicians have been disappointing. Anyway, these are the 3 Visualpolitik 2022 Political Anti-awards. Without any further ado, the Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-award, Liz Truss. Doom and gloom headlines about the British economy are everywhere. And the truth is that the last few years have not been particularly buoyant. Moreover, Brexit has generated a lot of uncertainty to the point that today the country looks doomed. However, Liz Truss had a plan to overcome all these pitfalls and put the UK back on the growth path. In fact, her plan could be summed up precisely like this.
I have 3 priorities for our economy. Growth, growth, and growth.
The problem is that this Prime Minister only lasted less than 50 days in office. This meant that Liz Truss went down in history for being the tenant who stayed the shortest time at 10 Downing Street. It all began at the end of September on the 23rd, when Liz Truss, with her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, presented their economic programme somewhat similar to Reaganomics. We're talking about a plan based on tax cuts, deregulation, exploitation of the country's hydrocarbons, including fracking, and also a plan of up to £150 billion to subsidise energy prices for families and businesses. The plan was tremendously ambitious, and in the current circumstances, it could make a lot of sense. Perhaps the only controversial point was the massive budget hole that would be created in the short term. This ended up causing a major sterling crisis in the markets. Regardless of whether the plan made any sense, the truth is that things could hardly have been worse. It was announced by surprise, without support, and a plan of action. The plan was not even well detailed, and the sequence of events was even worse. After the pound crisis broke out, a financial backlash from the markets caught them entirely by surprise. Then, the government first chose to look the other way. Then, they tried to give explanations. A few days later, Truss sacked her Chancellor of the Exchequer and loyal political ally, and shortly afterward, sent practically the whole plan straight to the waste paper basket. Wait, we're British. Rubbish bin. The whole plan went straight to the rubbish bin. Her plan. The same programme with which she had come to the government. Of course, that was not only the end of the plan, but the end of Liz Truss herself. Well, her political career, that is. Pay attention to the dates. On September 23rd, the government presented its big political bet, an economic and political revolution for the United Kingdom. On October 14th, the Prime Minister forced the resignation of Kwasi Kwarteng, who found out by surprise when he was defending the plan in Washington before the IMF. Just 6 days later, on October 20th, Liz Truss had to announce her resignation, which became effective on October 25th. In total, she was only in office for 49 days. Of course, that's not all. Truss's departure is not even the end of the story. Her departure not only meant a change of government, the end of her reform programme, and a historic slump in the Conservative Party polls, it also put an end to a whole line of political action. Her successor at 10 Downing Street, Rishi Sunak, has decided to follow a completely opposite course to that set by Truss. Tax hikes, curb military spending growth, and backtrack on fracking. Without going any further, Sunak's policy shift will take the tax burden to new record levels since the post-war era. So, for the manifest incompetence with which she managed her short term in office, for her betrayal of her political partner Kwasi Kwarteng to try to save herself, and all the political consequences of her lousy head of government, Liz Truss gets one of the Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-awards. Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-award, Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron is the perfect definition of what we mean by a Visualpolitik Anti-award. A politician who makes changes, but in the end, he remains halfway. And when an extraordinary event demands leadership, he fails on all 4 sides. That is why this politician has perhaps disappointed us more than any other. In 2017, we gave him an award on this same channel. Yep, you heard that right, but not an anti-award, an award. Back then, much was expected of this man, but 5 years later, he surprised us, and not for the better. He has some successes, but also many failures in his domestic policy. An example is the pension reform that still needs to be approved, a reform that, in itself, is already quite insufficient. But all these are minor details compared to his foreign policy. But what has Macron done to make us so bitter against him? The answer is simple. He's become a sort of Putin's useful fool in Europe. Just like that, without further palliatives. It is not that France has hidden interest in Russia, which lead them to defend Putin in all debates. Unlike Germany, France is not so dependent on Russian gas. Unlike India, France does not depend on trade with Russia at all. The only reason that explains Macron's decisions is his lust for the limelight. Macron wants France to lead a diplomatic stance, different from that of the United States or Poland, plain and simple. He wants to have a unique voice, distinct from the others on the international scene. And even if that means favouring Putin. And you'll say, come on Josh, aren't you exaggerating? Well, let's take a look at the various polls Macron has left us this year, starting with this one. In the coming weeks, we need to bring to being a European proposal to build a new security and stability order. We need to build it between Europeans, then share it with our allies in the NATO framework. Speech by Emmanuel Macron at the European Parliament. Okay, this sentence doesn't sound so bad until we put it into context. This is what Macron said weeks before Russia sent the tanks to Kyiv. What Macron was proposing here is for Europe to negotiate with Russia behind America's back. Now, this is nothing new. In 2019, Macron went so far as to say that NATO was in a state of brain death, and that Europe needed to build its own military. The problem? The problem is that, as of today, Europe can only defend itself with the help of the United States. To give you an idea, there are more than 100,000 American soldiers on European soil. Moreover, Washington accounts for 69% of all NATO spending. In other words, it would take years for Europe to have an army that could stand up to its adversaries without needing the United States. Or is it a good idea for Europe to have its own army? Maybe, or maybe not. We can discuss it, but always thinking in the long term. But what is clear is that at the moment we are in, proposing something like this is a real present for Vladimir Putin. And why, you may ask, does Macron want Europe to turn its back on the United States? Well, mainly because of the war in Ukraine. Let's put it plainly. At the moment, there are two opposing positions in Europe. On the one hand, we have the countries that defend Ukraine unreservedly, and to that end, are ready to send whatever aid is necessary. This includes the United States, the United Kingdom, and Poland. On the other hand, we have the countries that do not want a victory for the Ukrainian side. Some say so in a veiled way, others not so much. France seems to boast about it. Pay attention to Macron's second pearl. Russia must not be humiliated in Ukraine, says Emmanuel Macron. And the problem is again in the context, because of course the question is, what exactly does it mean that Russia should not be humiliated? Should we allow them to take half of Ukraine? How far should we allow Russian expansionism? Anyone remember Hitler's appeasement? Unfortunately, all these are not just mere statements. They also translate into facts. So pay attention to this chart. Here you can see the military aid to Ukraine by countries. France has sent the same amount of armament as a country like the Czech Republic. This is especially striking, considering that France is not only the second largest economy in the Eurozone, but also the country that spends the most on defense in Europe, only behind the UK. And not only that, France is one of the world's leading arms exporters. Yet, they have hardly cooperated with Ukraine, and the few times they have done so, it has been reluctantly. For example, the United Kingdom has trained more than 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Other European countries have done the same. France has only trained 40. At least, these were the estimates in September. But we are not only talking about military aid. As you know, another consequence of the Ukrainian war is the energy crisis that Europe is suffering. Until this year, Germany and many other countries were dependent on Russian gas for their energy system. This puts the whole of Europe in a weak position against Russia. However, Southern Europe had other suppliers, such as Algeria. Spain could distribute much of their Algerian gas to the rest of the continent, and also a lot of gas from the rest of the world, because Spain is the largest powerhouse in regasification of liquefied natural gas in Europe. The problem? That, for the moment, there are no pipelines connecting the Iberian Peninsula with France, and therefore the rest of the continent. Would it be enough to solve the energy crisis? Not at all. But it would undoubtedly be a great help. Well, it was at that moment that, against all odds, Macron said the following. France keeps blocking Midcat gas interconnection with Spain. Meanwhile, Macron continues to ask Europe to give security guarantees to Russia, and he remains determined to be the man who will one day broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. But by the looks of things, it seems that his recipe for peace is typically French dish. surrender. While adopting such a cowardly tone with Putin, Macron has not shaken his pulse when intervening militarily in his former African colonies, cheap pacifism when dealing with Putin, and neo-colonialism when it comes to having Africa under his control. For all this, our second Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-Award goes to Emmanuel Macron. Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-Award, Pedro Castillo.
Esta vez un gobierno del pueblo ha llegado para gobernar con el pueblo y para el pueblo. Es la primera vez que nuestro país será gobernado por un campesino, una persona que pertenece, como muchos de los peruanos, a los sectores oprimidos por tantos siglos.
Okay, as a good populist leader, we did not expect much from him. However, Pedro Castillo has been so disappointing that he deserved to get an anti-award. Pedro Castillo was a complete disaster. On top of that, his government ended in the worst possible way, with a coup attempt to bypass the constitution. Pedro Castillo gave the most absurd, shortest, and ridiculous coup attempt in history. In just 3 hours, this man decreed the dissolution of the parliament, left the presidential palace, lost his post, and was arrested by his own security detail. All this without anyone mediating to support his coup on the table. Of course, this chaotic outcome was but the last act of a presidency as incompetent as it was controversial. José Pedro Castillo Terrones took over the Peruvian government barely a year and a half before his fall on July 28, 2021. And he did so with a speech full of grandiloquent promises about social justice, the fight against large mining corporations, and the curbing of the savage capitalism that is supposedly devouring Peru. The truth is that we did not expect anything from a president who, although he later denied it, during the campaign even raised the possibility of nationalizing companies, ended the capitalization pension model, punishing imports, and suspending free trade agreements, among many other issues. In this line, one of his great obsessions was putting the country's most important economic sector in his sights. Pedro Castillo, we will nationalize mining companies if the people require it. We're talking about a sector that plans to invest tens of billions of dollars in the country over the next few years that already generates almost 20% of public income, about 200,000 direct jobs, and more than 1.3 million indirect jobs. In other words, no more and no less. One of the country's major sources of wealth. And what can I say? Surely there will be things to improve, both in mining and in politics, the economy, and Peruvian society. But nationalizations, revolutions, protectionism, social revenge, none of these are starting off on the right foot. Even if you tell me that all was just fireworks and Castillo did not have the parliamentary majority to do any of these things, it doesn't matter. An obvious red flag. Of course, if there is one thing that we can be clear, is that Castillo, even without expectations, has managed to disappoint. Castillo practically failed to do anything during the 495 full days of his presidency, neither for good nor for bad. His government was a constant coming and going of new ministers, and I'm not exaggerating. In less than a year and a half, this president came to have 5 governments and 78 different ministers. A real madness. Practically, his time in the presidential palace can be summed up in one figure. More than 200 political scandals in less than 500 days. And be careful, because corruption was not just left out either. The year and a half of Castillo's presidency was more than enough time for the now former president to string together a string of investigations for corruption and influence peddling. To top it all off, his departure from power barely a year and a half after becoming president could not have been worse. An attempted institutional coup, as ridiculous as it was ineffective. A run to the Mexican embassy, slowed down by the exhausting traffic of Lima. Nobody thought about the traffic jams. And finally, a wave of political and social violence. After the arrest and vacancy of the president, several extremist political organizations have taken to the streets to demand such things as the resignation of President Dina Boluarte, the dissolution of Congress, the installation of a constituent assembly, and the immediate convocation of new presidential and legislative elections, even though these things are not provided for in the country's constitutional framework. During the first 15 days of protests, at least 25 people lost their lives, and hundreds were injured. And as you can imagine, if there is one thing the former president has done, it has been to throw more gasoline on the fire. Enough is enough. The outrage, humiliation, and mistreatment continue. Today, my freedom is again restricted with 18 months of preventative imprisonment. I ask the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to intercede for my rights and the rights of my Peruvian brothers and sisters who are crying out for justice. I hold judges and prosecutors responsible for what happens in the country. Millions of thanks to my compatriots for their love and support. Only the people save the people. Pedro Castillo. We've already told you on Visualpolitik, Peru has a huge institutional problem, and political political disloyalty has become the usual rule of conduct among most political groups. But pouring more gasoline on the fire is nothing more than wanting to condemn Peru to a future of violence, confrontation, tension, and frustration. So, Castillo's term as president of Peru will go down in history as a particularly low point in Peruvian democracy. So, these are our Visualpolitik 2022 Anti-awards. And now, we're almost done. And I say almost because we are missing something essential. Dear friends, no matter how many political disappointments we may have, life is much more than that. Enjoying each day in the company of our loved ones is a real privilege we all have to try to take advantage of. On behalf of the entire Visualpolitik team, we want to show you our gratitude for being there on the other side of the screen. And we hope you had a Merry Christmas and a happy end of the year. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos. Hit that notification button because we're here every week, and we'll see you in the next one. Happy New Year.